10:26, let's talk to our political guru, Norman Smith, who has been looking at whether new Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has already changed the rules of political interviewing. Norman, I'm intrigued. Go ahead.
Well, Vic, the thought is this. We've seen how Jeremy Corbyn has changed the rules when it comes to Prime Minister's questions, doing it in a very, very different style. Last night, he did a big round of broadcast interviews, the set-piece political interviews, and again, seemed to completely change the rules, to chuck the old sort of textbook out the window. Now, this is where we do our sort of interviews at the Beeb at Westminster. Someone's doing an interview in there. This is kind of, if you turn around here, you'll see where we do most of the a lot of the sort of set-piece television interviews we'll do here. So I would sit down here and the politician, Jeremy Corbyn or whatever, would sit down there. And they are actually extraordinarily formulaic in the sense that the politician comes in, he has rehearsed, prepared his lines, he knows the sound bites he wants to give, he's carefully worked out what he's wearing, he knows whether to cross his leg or to uncross his leg. There is a fraught negotiation beforehand, usually with his minders or with the politician about, the backdrop, is the cushion too high, so on and so forth. Jeremy Corbyn did it entirely differently last night. Just have a look at his sort of pre-match conversation. It wasn't a negotiation, it was just a chat with the camera crews and the interviewers.
Hi, how you doing?
Hello, Jeremy. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you. Hi.
Yeah, hi.
Do you all need tea or anything? Or are you all right?
Fine.
That's very kind. I'll just very quickly say this is Katie, who runs everything at the
Hi,
BBC.
Katie.
She's my boss. Chris and Jess, who work with me, and you'll see all of us around a lot in the next hour.
Nice to see you all. Welcome. Thank you very much. You're welcome. Thank you very much.
Now, what was interesting, when the interview got underway, normally politicians, they know their answers before you've even asked the question. But Jeremy Corbyn last night, almost frankly, seemed to be thinking aloud. So when he was asked a question about the Privy Council and whether he would join it and whether he would kneel before the Queen, you could see him actually almost pondering aloud as to what he was actually going to do. And that is completely different to what we normally expect from politicians. Have a listen to his answer.
Let's say Downing Street have said you are being invited to join the Privy Council. You say you will accept that. Part of that involves kneeling before the Queen. Will you do that?
I didn't know that was involved, actually. So we'll have to find out about it. Okay?
But will you do it? That isn't the ceremony. That is what is involved.
Okay, thank you.
Thinking.
Well, of course I'll end up being a member of the Privy Council if that's what the requirement of the job is. I think there are some things that ought to change in our society, and maybe that's one of them.
The other thing that struck me, Vic, is normally if you ask a politician a hypothetical question, they'll just say, that's a hypothetical question, so I'm not going to answer it. Jeremy Corbyn last night noted when he was asked a hypothetical question that it was a hypothetical question and then answered it. Watch this.
If David Cameron doesn't get a deal that you agree with, can you see Jeremy Corbyn as leader of the Labour Party hypothetically campaigning to leave the EU?
Well, it's a hypothetical question, but what I would do first of all is strongly oppose what Cameron has done and say we have to stay in Europe to change those policies, and that would be a manifesto commitment up to 2020. But we're working this position out at the moment.
That's fascinating, though, because that's a change, a very clear change in your position.
Now, what I find interesting, Vic, is whether Mr. Corbyn is actually onto something here, whether people are tired of the very, pat set-piece interview with the sound bites and everything carefully prepared in advance, and actually rather like this more casual, less fussy, more open interview where politicians have space to actually think aloud without being leapt on. The counter view would be, well, it looks confused, it's uncertain, there's a lack of leadership. But, if nothing else, it seems to be Mr. Corbyn is forcing us all just to think about how we do our business.
Thank you very much, Norman. I'm really interested to hear what our audience thinks about that, what voters think about that. They will tell us, no doubt, in the next few minutes. But in fact, this email from Peter's just come in. It says this: oops, Norman, the political world is changing, so you're not in control. Maybe it's time the importance of the interviewer has come to an end.
Yeah, here. I don't have a problem with that at all.
No.
I think, maybe Mr. Corbyn has tapped into something, because even if you talk to journalists like me, there is a certain weariness about the set-piece interview where you can ask a question and then you'll get the answer. Then you ask a different question and you still get the same answer. I mean, it has become routine and frankly uninformative, many interviews. So maybe it's not just the politicians that need to think again, but maybe we journalists need to think again, and maybe we have to allow politicians to express views which aren't strictly always on the line and totally in accordance with party policy, and maybe that might encourage a more open and discursive form of political debate, which, let's be honest, would be a good thing.
Totally agree. Thank you very much, Norman. Thank you. Let's go back to Norman Smith at Westminster. About 20 minutes or so ago, he asked what you thought of the way Jeremy Corbyn did various political interviews last night. Norman, I've got loads of emails, tweets and all the rest of it from our audience. Shall I read you some?
Do.
Yeah, okay, so Jerry says, we've waited years for an honest politician who speaks his mind. Eileen, Mr. Corbyn is breaking through the mainstream stranglehold which has dominated our screens. At last, some sincerity. Chris tweets, we are tired of production line politicians and sound bites. They're supposed to represent the people and so on and so forth. But Eileen, another woman earlier, I think she was Eileen, said, the idea that he didn't know that the requirement of being a leader of the opposition meant you were on the Privy Council. She just didn't buy that.
Yeah, Vic, we have to be careful not to be too naive about this, in that, let's not kid ourselves that suddenly all politicians are going to come out and be open and, just think about questions before they answer them, and it's not going to be pre-prepared sound bites, because, politics is a very brutal game, and you wonder whether politicians are going to take the risk of doing that, because it seems to me we're kind of locked in a deadly embrace, politicians and the broadcasters. We ask them questions, they don't answer it. So whenever they say anything a little out of line, we leap on it, which makes them even less likely to answer a question because they think they can't say anything. And frankly, it has become stultifying. But I do wonder if, not just, with Mr. Farage, but broader, people are looking for different sort of politicians who are willing to engage. You look at someone like Nigel Farage, another case. I mean, he often answers off the cuff and it gets him into all sorts of trouble. But clearly people do find that refreshing. Even if you think of Donald Trump in the United States now, he may say the most outlandish things, but at least he says what he thinks. And I wonder if we are reaching the end of the era of the kind of soundbite politician who just sticks to the script. And that is what is so interesting about Mr. Corbyn and the way he does these interviews, because it does seem to suggest that he is going to adopt a different approach. And what's going to be interesting is whether he can stick to it, or whether sort of the Westminster machine just chews him up and there's accusations of confusion and splits and uncertainty. We'll have to wait and see.
That's the music. It means our time is up.
Not much doubt about the man of the week. Television news bulletins have been full of discussion, debate and analysis of the new leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, elected last Saturday with almost 60% of the vote.
Fantastic moment, fantastic mandate for change in Britain, fantastic enthusiasm for real democratic politics. It's a great day.
But barely had the result been announced before criticisms were being aired about his policies, his style of leadership, even his dress sense. So has BBC News merely been reflecting the reality of Jeremy Corbyn's first few days in his post and the response of politicians and commentators, or is it following a doom-laden narrative about the Labour leader set by the right-wing press? He's not the first opposition leader to face a torrent of abuse from a hostile media. Remember the mockery of William Hague and Ian Duncan Smith? Labour leaders have been given a particularly tough time from some newspapers. Unlike them, though, the BBC has an obligation towards impartiality and balance, one it's failed to fulfil this week, according to Jan Child. All the Beeb seems interested in doing is putting a negative spin on everything and digging up gainsayers just because one member of the shadow cabinet may hold different views from what it assumes Corbyn's to be. I'd call that inclusivity and openness to multiple viewpoints. How refreshing.
Thank you for all your cooperation.
Mr Corbyn might say he's simply embracing a variety of opinions among his team. The critics just see confusion over policies, ranging from the welfare cap to the European Union. And a fresh approach was apparent in a more polite than normal Prime Minister's question time. But the BBC still headlined this as Corbyn versus Cameron, before changing that to a more consensual sounding Corbyn and Cameron.
People want a different kind of politics. People want a different way, a different kind of politician. I think the BBC needs to realise that politics is changing, and Jeremy Corbyn's popularity came from a movement, a grassroots movement of hundreds of thousands of people, and if it continues just to only court the views of the political classes, it's going to be out of touch, because many people are turning away from mainstream media to alternative sources of information, and it's a shame.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Much of Jeremy Corbyn's electoral success in the Labour leadership contest has been attributed to his defiance of traditions, his use of social media and his appeal to younger voters. But has the BBC woken up to this new issue-driven style of politics, or is it still stuck in an old Westminster-based left-wing, right-wing mindset?
The idea that you need to hang a label round his neck and call him left-wing seems to be endemic. So there is this subtle inference that Jeremy Corbyn is dangerous. And that's what comes across. And that's what irritates mostly my young daughters, who see an unbalanced approach. They want to see a change. They want to see a different attitude taken on by people like the BBC. So we come back to this point about having pre-formed reporters and journalists who already have in their minds a set idea about what should happen and how people should appear and what those people should say and how they should express themselves.
Airtime has been given this week to the question of whether Mr Corbyn would wear a red poppy on Remembrance Day, and to his failure to sing the national anthem during a service to mark the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Britain. David Lindsley thought that attention was unwarranted, writing, "I am not a Labour supporter. However, I find Mr Corbyn's lead a good example of grown-up politics, where the facts are important and the trivia of dress code and taking part in rituals come way down the list of priorities. What a shame the BBC is making the trivial and very shallow aspects a priority on its news feeds." There was also coverage of the Labour leader's apparent reluctance to speak to the media, pulling out of a pre-arranged BBC interview and ignoring reporters chasing him down the street.
Have you got anything to say about that?
Part of that involves kneeling before the Queen. Will you do that?
On Wednesday evening, he did speak to the BBC's political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, but that gave rise to another objection. What a complete waste of time, Laura Kuenssberg's persistent questioning as to whether or not he would kneel before the Queen. She lowered herself and the BBC into the howling pack of tabloid wolves, trying to find something to belittle his beliefs and make him a national villain. Plenty of questions raised there, so let's discuss them with Katie Searle, the BBC's editor of Political News. Over the last couple of weeks, including before his election, we've had a lot of complaints to Newswatch that BBC coverage has just been innately hostile to Corbyn as a danger or a bad thing. Can you see why?
Actually, I disagree with that. I think if you look back to when the leadership contest started, we did a huge amount of coverage of the growing and popular campaign that he built up. And it was quite a story. And over the summer, actually, we were drawn, as other media were, to this campaign that was so successful in the end. And because of the nature of it, much of it was extremely positive. So actually, in terms of the overall coverage, I think it has been a very, very positive message. This week's been a little bit different because he's obviously won the leadership contest. He has a huge mandate, and that's led us to really have to ask questions about what type of political leader he's going to be and what type of policies he will put forward. And that's where we've been able to highlight differences, if you like, within his own shadow cabinet or questions within the party itself to try and present to the audience, look, you have a new opposition leader. Who is he and what does he believe in?
Viewers are very aware that there's an overwhelmingly hostile press agenda against Jeremy Corbyn, and they feel the BBC allows itself to be led by that agenda, the agenda that the papers want to set.
I think we're really aware as an organisation of the right-wing press. And actually, we do discuss these things in meetings, and the conversation would often say, well, of course, that would be true of what the Telegraph might say, or the Times, or the Daily Mail, and and we discuss, as we do actually with all stories, about how press represent stories and how we would do that differently. Of course, we have an absolute commitment to impartiality, so it's up to us to then look at what we think as impartial journalists and what we think the questions are for the audience want answered.
You see, those things like pressing him on whether he'll kneel to the Queen, which Laura Kuenssberg did, or speculating about whether he will wear a poppy, that's trivial to many viewers, and those stories have been very much leading the newspapers that are hostile to him.
I understand why some viewers wouldn't be interested in that. I think that's completely fair, but there'd be many things they would be interested in, like the debate on the EU, for example, or the welfare cap, which we've also done a lot on. Actually, if you look at the debate over the national anthem, I absolutely stand by our decision to put that in. I think it was a really, really interesting and important thing to look at. When you look at the picture that the press had picked up initially from the ceremony, it was quite marked that he was not singing, and he'd made that a definite decision. Actually, it's even more interesting to go on to say he's now changed his mind, and he has said after that incident that he will sing the national anthem. I understand that actually a lot of viewers will think that it's a trivial thing to look at, and I think that's absolutely fair comment, but it is unusual for the leader of the opposition not to sing a national anthem at an important ceremony like that.
A sense we got from a lot of those viewer comments we've just heard and read is that they like the fact that there's a new approach he's bringing. He's trying to win round colleagues who might disagree with him, a new approach to Prime Minister's questions, and maybe BBC political reporters have got their head stuck in an old confrontational mindset where you're looking for the differences as if that's a bad thing necessarily.
I think it's really, really important that we reset our minds as well. And I think that is a fair thing to bring up, because actually we have all lived in a time of left-right, and this is a new kind of politics. One of the things we're going to be looking at this week is actually whether he can translate his growth in support into a wider electoral support, and whether this growth of young political views actually is sustainable, and whether they'll stay with the Labour Party. And I think that is the next question, actually, as to whether this can be more sustainable for even Mr. Corbyn thought himself.
From a news point of view, the next question is, though, if he has many more youthful voters, are we hearing those voices reflected in coverage of him and understanding his success? In fact, are they harder in a way for you to find? They're not in the Westminster Village.
Well, as I said earlier, I think we've done an awful lot of them, easily provided by his hustings and the huge amount of support that we saw often queuing down the street over the summer. And they were there, and it's great for us as television producers to go there and find these voices so easily. This week, I think actually rightly, it's become slightly more wholly more back to the Westminster Village, because it's the first time he was in Prime Minister's questions. It was the first week back after the election and the summer of the leadership contest. So inevitably we're going to hear from the backbenches. But actually, we're now going to go into conference season. Next weekend, we have the Labour conference down in Brighton, and it's going to be full, I suspect, of his supporters. And we'll have them, again, right there to hear and test their views as well.
Katie Sill, thank you very much.